650 miles south of the Popham colony, the London Company had secured its own precarious foothold in Virginia. Its settlers would face far worse than Popham's men, and they would survive, though only just. It would be here, along the James River, that England would begin to dump its unwanted and treat them like livestock. One 18th century writer would call conditions in the colony worse than Egyptian bondage. The London Company's expedition was led by a fierce one-armed veteran. Christopher Newport had made his reputation more than a decade earlier, plundering and burning on the Spanish Main as one of Sir Walter Raleigh's captains. He was grizzled and gruff, and could have accumulated enough money to retire long before the London Company approached him. In 1592, he helped to capture the Madre de Dios, the huge Spanish treasure ship seized off Santo Domingo. Captain Newport sailed her back to England, the richest prize that English privateers ever recorded. She carried gold and silver worth about 15 million pounds at today's prices. It is not known what Christopher Newport's share was. As well as bullion, the Madre de Dios was said to be carrying a fabulous hoard of precious stones. The gems had vanished by the time Newport dropped anchor in home waters and welcomed visitors aboard. Every member of the crew is thought to have shared in them, presumably the captain amongst them. The London Company put Christopher Newport in command of a difficult group of men on board 3 ships. There was a 120-ton merchantman named the Susan Constant and 2 smaller vessels, the Godspeed and the Discovery. Spread among them were 120 men and boys. A few were craftsmen, and 20 were listed as laborers. The biggest group comprised young gentlemen of one sort or another who had contracted to stay with the company for 7 years as tenants. They included young bloods, dreaming of easy riches, and troublesome ne'er-do-wells, dispatched by their families to get rid of them or teach them a lesson. One member of the party described them as unruly gallants sent to Virginia to escape ill destinies. This voyage into the unknown was, he suggested, a chance for parents to disburden themselves of lascivious sons, masters of bad servants, and wives of ill husbands. Later, the alleged misbehavior of this gallant band would be used to justify the suspension of individual rights for the majority of colonial settlers. On this first voyage, it was the behavior of the leaders that most threatened the enterprise. They were domineering, fractious characters. There was Newport's number 2, the aggressively self-confident Bartholomew Gosnold, whose own expedition 5 years earlier had done so much to turn English eyes towards America again. There was the former soldier, Edward Maria Wingfield, who had mortgaged his estate to take a block of shares in the venture. He was the only major stockholder coming along to risk his life as well as his money. There was Captain John Martin, the son of London's leading goldsmith, who was obsessed with finding gold. And George Percy, the arrogant brother of the Duke of Northumberland. Most disruptive of all was the turbulent adventurer John Smythe, a yeoman's farmer's son who, according to his own account, would one day be saved from death by the Native American princess Pocahontas. Smythe was a vividly persuasive writer who portrayed himself as the heroic savior of the colony, and perhaps he was. He would certainly go down in history as one of the most significant players in the American story. Of the rest of the party, the histories of some gentlemen on board are known, but nothing about the fry, the scattering of servants, and the 20 laborers brought to do manual work. In the 1600s, there was no Robert Trestle to record their stories. All we know is that they were waged men, and that there would soon be complaints that there weren't nearly enough of them to build a colony. The flotilla set sail from London in Christmas week 1606, watched wistfully, no doubt, by an eminent prisoner in the Tower, the inspiration of them all, Sir Walter Raleigh. The battlements of his prison must have afforded a fine view of the 3 ships as they upped anchor and made their way downstream. Of all the spectators who witnessed them depart, Raleigh was among the few who could have had an inkling of how momentous the event taking place might prove to be. It was a meticulously planned expedition, equipped with mining and building tools, large stocks of arms and ammunition, and food calculated to feed everyone for a year. Carried in Christopher Newport's cabin was a sealed list of instructions from the Royal Council for Virginia that were to be opened within 24 hours of landing. In 5 pages, the instructions covered everything from relations with the natural people of the country to who should lead the hunt for gold. The document also contained the names of 7 men picked to form an administrative council that would choose a president and rule the colony. Not even those named yet knew who they were. Newport's problems began when, like Henry Challen's, he chose the longer route to America via the Azores. A series of setbacks en route saw the party spend 19 fractious years at sea, eating into their food supplies and into their tempers. Long claustrophobic days at sea could have fatal results. On both the first circumnavigation of the world by Ferdinand Magellan and the second by Sir Francis Drake, shipboard relations took such terrible turns that the commanders hanged good friends on both occasions, crying mutiny. Newport found himself similarly placed, as the collection of supersized egos around him clashed. Finally, at a stopover in the Azores, he erected gallows, fully intending to execute John Smythe. Although Newport relented and postponed the execution, the rancor and bickering continued up to the moment of landing. When the flotilla finally sighted mainland America, at what should have been a moment for rejoicing, a row broke out. It was just after dawn on Sunday in April 1607. The ships had been blown by a storm to the mouth of Chesapeake Bay. When Newport opted to make for the invitingly sheltered waters of the bay, he was furiously criticized by Bartholomew Gosnold, who insisted it was a bad decision, and tried to force Newport to head out again and steer northwards. Newport indignantly refused. They entered the bay and anchored, sending a party of 20 men ashore to scout around. According to John Smythe, the party was met with a shower of arrows from the natives. A volley of musket fire from the Susan Constant put the attackers to flight, but it was a bad start. What followed in the Chesapeake would be far grimmer than anything experienced by Sir John Popham's colonists. The latter would be lambasted for scurrying back home after a harsh winter and a small number of deaths. Disease, desertion, and attack by Native Americans cut the London Company's numbers far more savagely over a similar period, and cut them again and again after reinforcements arrived. As a modern British historian puts it, quote, "The more the early history of Virginia is studied, the more it must, and did, appear miraculous that the colony survived." Sir Thomas Smythe and the other members of the Royal Council of Virginia had not expected the expedition to be anything less than hard-going, as was evident from the secret instructions. They were the foundations for what Richard Hakluyt would later call a prison without walls. One instruction barred anyone from quitting the colony. Quote, "Suffer no man to return but by passport." Another banned all communication with the homeland. And one warned of disorder, directing that in laying out the settlement, every street should be wide and straight, so that with low field pieces you may command every street throughout. It is doubtful that all the instructions are read out to every one of the 120 men and boys in the party. If they had been read out, it is unlikely that many would have been especially bothered. Most of the young adventurers were too gripped by gold fever to worry about much else. They spent several weeks exploring, endowing every striking spur and landmark with an English name, usually of a British royal or a Protestant saint, like tomcats marking their territory. Finally, they identified what seemed to be the ideal location for a fort, on an easily defensible island on the James River, and so Fort James was established. It would later become known as Jamestown. The site proved anything but ideal. The fragility of the project was swiftly brought home to them, or it should have been. Having picked the site for their fort, the most capable leaders, Gosnold and Newport, left others to begin constructing it, and took men off on a week-long search for gold. While they were gone, an attack by Algonquin tribesmen almost overwhelmed those left behind. The colonists were busy clearing the ground, and were so oblivious to danger that firearms had not even been distributed. When the attack came, it was claimed that 200 or more tribesmen were involved. As the Algonquin charged out of the concealment into the woods, several gentlemen with guns just managed to hold them off, but it took cannon and musketry from the Susan Constant to turn the attackers back. It was a close call. Quote, "Most of the council was hurt, a boy slain in the pinnace, and 13 or 14 more hurt." For days, the future Jamestown was under virtual siege. On and off war with the local inhabitants became par for the course. Little was known in England about the Algonquin people, who had named the great inland around which they lived Chesapeake, Great Shellfish Bay. The secret instructions called for great care to be taken not to offend the natural people of the country, but also assume the worst. The colonists were instructed that if they shot at the naturals, they should employ the best marksmen. Quote, "If you miss, they will think your weapons not so terrible." No doubt, the still greater shock and awe capacity of a Susan Constant broadside was added comfort for the colonists. One of the other forces undermining the colonists, disease, struck almost as quickly as the Algonquin. The riverside site chosen for Jamestown was on top of a mosquito-ridden swamp, used by some of the party as a latrine and drinking well. Within a month of the departure of Christopher Newport's flotilla for England in July for supplies and new recruits, the colonists began to die in ones and twos. The suffering has been depicted with Gothic gusto by later historians, but the roll call of death recorded by one of the colonists is coldly eloquent. Quote, "The 6th of August there died John Asby of the Bloody Flux. The 9th day died George Flower of the Swelling. The 10th day died William Brewster, gentleman, of a wound given by the savages. The 14th day Jerome Alcock died, ancient and of a wound. The same day Francis Midwinter, Edward Morris, corporal, died suddenly. The 15th day there died Edward Brown and Stephen Galthrop. The 16th day there died Thomas Gower, gentleman. The 17th day there died Thomas Mounsley. The 18th day there died Robert Pennington and John Martin, gentlemen. The 19th day died Drew Pigassy, gentlemen. The 22nd day of August there died Captain Bartholomew Gosnold, one of our council. More than half would be dead by the time Christopher Newport returned in October. He had left 104 alive, 48 were still living on his return. Most of the reinforcements he brought would soon die, too. So would the majority of the following year's intake, because hunger followed on disease. Too little food had been sent, too much consumed in the early days, and too much lost to rats that had migrated with the settlers to the New World. There had been a belief that sufficient supplies could be traded from the Native Americans to tide the colony over till its own crops were harvested. This was a terrible mistake. In 1608, the rats devoured the first crop of English corn, and the fledgling community was driven alternately to negotiate, trade, or raid for foodstuffs. But none of that was sufficient, and famine set in. The starving time was approaching. As conditions worsened, the leaders on the ruling council squabbled and connived and replaced one another. One was hanged for mutiny. In this sorry atmosphere, some young bloods vanished and somehow made their way back to England, but others were still hypnotized by gold and they remained. It was the same with the colony's backers in London. The company kept the money flowing on the premise that gold and other rich minerals, principally copper, would be found eventually. They thought they had found gold on several occasions. A report by an Irishman, Francis McGill, obtained by the Spanish Council of State, claimed that rich samples of gold, silver, and copper had been sent to England. McGill reckoned the authorities blocked all communications home, not to prevent bad news getting out, but quite the opposite, to prevent the outside world knowing that immense wealth was there for the taking. One of the most embarrassing episodes in the search for gold occurred after a mineral expert from England noticed a glittering clay-like substance used by one of the local tribes to daub their bodies. The expert thought the glitter came from specks of gold. A party of colonists, led by an Algonquin guide, trekked into the hills to locate the mine from which the gold-bearing clay was extracted. They returned with a barrel load of the stuff. An excited Christopher Newport assumed that he was about to become a very rich man, and hurried back to England in the Susan Constant with the barrel of clay and the minerals expert. The impact of the news of the gold on those of the settlers who were still alive was described succinctly by John Smythe, quote, "There was now no talk, no hope, no work, but dig gold, wash gold, refine gold, load gold." Smythe was a lone voice on the council, urging other priorities. In England, Newport and his expert presented the barrel and its glittering contents to Sir Walter Cope, the Chancellor, who was a member of the Royal Council of Virginia. An ecstatic Cope passed the news to Robert Cecil. "There is but a barrel full of the earth," he said, "but there seems a kingdom full of the ore." He counseled Cecil that even digging down a couple of spadefuls, the ore appears on every part as a solid body, a treasure endlessly proportioned by God. Almost immediately, Sir Walter Raleigh had to swallow his words. Quote, "This other day we sent you news of gold. In this day we cannot return you so much as copper. Our new discovery is more like to prove the land of Canaan than the land of Ophir." 4 tests by the most experienced men in London showed it was fool's gold. In the end, all turned to vapor. It is not known whether the rethink in London was prompted by this episode or by the increasing number of disaster stories coming from the colony, the deaths and desertions, or by the drain on funds, but the rethink was there. The thrust of it was set out in the Jacobean equivalent of a position paper drawn up for Sir Thomas Smythe, treasurer of the London Company. In the early weeks of 1609, under the heading "The Colonizing of Virginia," running to nearly 12,000 words, the unsigned document was an assessment of Virginia by someone closely attuned to James I's prejudices and ambitions. It urged that gold should be forgotten and a trading colony developed. Quote, "Trade is the best mine, and the greatest wealth which a prince can possess," it argued. The anonymous author asserted that trade had transformed England into a wealthy power over the previous century, and promised greater things yet if the natural wealth of America was harnessed properly. The king evidently listened. In May of 1609, he issued a new charter that exchanged royal control of Virginia for commercial control by the merchants of the London branch of the Virginia Company. The squabbling colonial executive in Jamestown was abolished. In its place, the colony was to be brought under a governor with dictatorial powers. Above him in London was a new royal council and the London Company's court, or board of directors. Above them all was the guiding hand of the company's treasurer, Sir Thomas Smythe, and it would be his hand that planted the seeds of white slavery. Few Englishmen could have appeared better qualified than Smythe to turn Virginia into a success. He is a strangely forgotten figure now, but for centuries his commercial stature was recognized by historians. The great Victorian Alexander Brown said of him, quote, "He was the head of everyone, and a founder of most of them, of the English companies directly interested in foreign colonies and commerce, which have ever since been the chief sources of the wealth and power of Great Britain." In Muscovy, the Tsar publicly acknowledged Smythe's eminence. When the merchant arrived at the head of an English mission, he was allowed to remain hatted in the royal presence, a signal honor. In Agra, the great Mogul had a portrait of Smythe hanging in his palace. In the Cape, men of the Quite tribe reportedly chanted, "Sir Thomas Smythe, English ship," whenever a ship flying the red and white striped flag of the East India Company anchored in Table Bay. Smythe combined astute risk-taking with ruthlessness and the wooing of princes. In India, he learned that the great Mogul and his son were heavy drinkers and regularly supplied the Mogul with the best Burgundy. Smythe also sent the mogul a full-size replica of the Lord Mayor of London's coach, like that used to this day to lead the Lord Mayor's annual procession. Smythe constantly cultivated the court of St. James. After the king developed an interest in exotic mammals and birds, Smythe had his captains return with parakeets and monkeys, big cats and bears for the royal cages. When James expressed interest in the flying squirrels rumored to exist in America, the order went out to Smith's ships to bring some back. King James was also fascinated by ships, so in 1610, Smythe invited him to launch one of his Indiamen, a 1,200-ton monster called the Trades Increase. The event gives a glimpse of the style of the man and his relationship with the king. On the day of the launch, James, together with the Queen, the heir to the throne, Prince Henry, and other members of the royal family, were rowed in the royal barge to Deptford, where the ship had been built. Other members of the court followed in what must have been, in the manner of the times, a splendid cavalcade, stretching downstream from the Palace of Whitehall to Deptford. After the launch came a bountiful banquet, with all kinds of delicates in fine china dishes, and then a royal presentation. The king, it was reported, graced Sir Thomas Smythe the governor with a very fair chain of gold, with a jewel wherein was the king's picture hanging at it, and the king put it about his neck with his own hands. A few months before the Trades Increase was launched, Smythe took over the direction of Virginia. An immediate and crucial decision was the appointment of the right caliber of men to take control of the colony on the ground. Whoever was picked as governor would have autocratic powers and an almost monarchical status. The choice eventually fell on 34-year-old Thomas West, Baron de la Warre. He and Thomas Smythe were old comrades. They had fought alongside each other in the raid on Cadiz, where both had been commended for bravery, and both had later been caught up in the Essex Rebellion, but survived. They had much in common, and no doubt were of a mind on how to revive fortunes in America. Smythe appointed 3 seasoned fighting men to serve under De La Warre. Sir George Somers, who had fought under Walter Raleigh, was made admiral of a new fleet to relieve the colony. Sir Thomas Gates, a veteran of war in the Netherlands, was appointed deputy governor, and Sir Thomas Dale, another veteran of the Dutch wars, was made high marshal. The next requirement was to reinstall a belief in the Virginia project in the public mind and raise money. The damage done by the stories of death and disaster filtering across the Atlantic can be gauged from a broadside published in a rebuttal a few years later. It attacked the malicious and looser sort, who wet their tongues with scornful taunts about the colony and asserted, quote, "There is no common speech nor public name of anything this day except to be the name of God, which is more wildly depraved, traduced, and derided by such unhallowed lips than the name of Virginia." The company launched a vigorous promotional campaign. Clerics were commissioned to urge congregations to go forward to assist this noble action. All the merchants connected with the company went to work on their friends. The little printing shops, huddled around St. Paul's churchyard, were paid to pump out broadsides and circulars lauding Virginia as an earthly paradise, a delicious land with gentle natives, and one of the goodliest countries under the sun. Smythe played on the patriotism and self-interest of Jacobean England. A broadside dedicated to him read, quote, "The eyes of all Europe are looking upon our endeavors to spread the gospel among the heathen people of Virginia, to plant an English nation there, and to settle a trade in those parts, which may be peculiar to our nation, to the end we may thereby be secured from being eaten out of all profits of trade by our more industrious neighbors, the Dutch." It became a priority to attract skilled workers rather than another batch of gentlemen adventurers. Every person that hath a trade or a body able to endure day's labor was promised 100 acres of land at the end of 7 years' service. Smythe, who clearly had no problems mixing with the low as well as the high, had a letter circulated that invited workmen of whatever craft who have any occupation to meet him at his house in Philpott Street. There, in his Cheapside mansion, the richest man in England was waiting to offer sawyers, tile makers, soap ashmen, pearl drillers, ploughmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, and sturgeon dressers, and all the other craftsmen and tradesmen, housing, food, clothes, a cash payment, and land if they would sign up for the New World. The net was cast wide. Glassmakers and winemakers were recruited from France and potash workers from Poland. Ministers of religion were on the recruitment list as well. The company issued instructions for Native American children to be kidnapped so they could be made into good Protestants. Whether Smythe followed Popham's lead by recruiting from the jails at this early stage is not known, but efforts were made to persuade the City of London to subsidize the relocation of the surplus poor. Two of those promoting the Virginia Company, Robert Johnson and Robert Gray, put the case for relocation using the arguments about an England drowning in vagrants. Johnson warned that unless the swarms of idle persons were found foreign employment, they would infect one another with vice and villainy, worse than the plague itself. The idea of an American solution to the problem of the poor appealed to the burghers of London. The very mention of the ragged masses who packed the tenements of Whitefriars, Aldgate, and Southwark prompted shivers of distaste and apprehension. When the Virginia Company offered to transport one poor inmate from the metropolis for every new share in the company purchased by the burghers, the Lord Mayor responded encouragingly. However, little appears to have come of this proposal. Nothing more would be heard of the idea of shipping out the adult poor for more than a decade. When not interviewing colonists, Sir Thomas trod the cobblestones between the halls of the great livery companies. He banked on their financial support, making an offer of either a cash dividend from the gold or other valuable commodities the company was bound to amass, or a dividend in land. Either way, it would be payable after 7 years. An investor buying a single £12 10 share could look forward eventually to a return of at least 500 acres. It was not an easy task to persuade his fellow merchants. The timing was appalling, for another venture was just being launched. This was the Ulster plantation, and the king let it be known that he regarded support for this Irish project as a patriotic obligation. Smythe, therefore, had an uphill struggle. His own livery company, the Skinners, bought only £62 of shares. The fishmonger's offer was so paltry it was scornfully refused. All told, the livery companies invested only a quarter of what he expected. In the end, more than 30 companies and 650 individuals took Virginia's £12 10 shares, but that brought in only £18,000. Smythe had hoped for £30,000. Despite the problems, a fleet was assembled to relieve and resupply Jamestown. It represented one of the largest colonial expeditions so far mounted by a European power. 9 ships with 600 settlers, including a scattering of women, set sail from Plymouth in the early summer of 1609. It was led by Sir Thomas Gates and Sir George Somers, and would be known as the Third Supply. The new governor of the colony, Lord de la Warr, was to follow on later. Luck was not with them. Off the Azores, a hurricane scattered the fleet. The flagship Sea Venture, carrying Somers, Gates, and another 150 passengers, was blown hundreds of miles off course. The storm was graphically described by one of the passengers, William Strachey, quote, "The sea swelled above the clouds, and gave battle unto heaven. A huge wave enveloped the vessel, like a garment or a vast cloud. From almost every joint, the ship spewed out her oakum, so that water rose swiftly in the hold. Terror turned the blood of even the bravest mariners." For 3 days, Somers was constantly at the helm, with everyone else bailing and plugging and throwing stores overboard to keep the Sea Venture afloat. The battered vessel eventually found herself in the Bermuda archipelago, dreaded by mariners as the Isle of Devils. Around these reefs, they said, you could hear the howling of the demons who lurked awaiting the sight of a sail to whip up a maelstrom. It was assumed that none caught in their seas could possibly survive. Against all odds, The Sea Venture stayed intact until Summers was able to beach her on one of the islands. She ended up in what we know today as Discovery Bay, Bermuda. The island was uninhabited, but a previous shipwreck had marooned a number of hogs there. The pigs had multiplied enormously and were easy to hunt down. A diet of pork, grapefruit, and wild berries kept the survivors going, but they did not confine themselves just to catching food to survive. Summers and Gates were determined men. Amongst the maroon were skilled carpenters and a shipwright. They were put to work to design and build a ship to take the party on their interrupted journey. Using oak salvaged from the Sea Venture and cedar wood from the island, the survivors built not one, but 2 pinnaces to carry them on to Virginia. The Patience and the Deliverance set sail 42 weeks after the Sea Venture was wrecked. Their voyage took 10 weeks. When the news of their epic story reached London, it caused a sensation. During the time on the island, Gates and Summers had imposed a ruthless regime, executing a group of men who questioned their authority. That was ignored. Instead, England celebrated what was seen as something truly miraculous. William Shakespeare immortalized the saga, drawing on it for his last great play, The Tempest. In Act 1, Shakespeare has his magician King Prospero order up a storm so terrible that not a soul but felt the fever of the mad, only to relent after the intercession of his daughter, Miranda, and then tell her, quote, "Wipe thou thine eyes, have comfort. The direful spectacle of the wreck, which touched the very virtue of compassion in thee, I have with such provision in mine art, so safely ordered, that there is no soul, no, not so much perdition as an hair, betide to any creature in the vessel, which thou heardest cry, which thou sawest sink." No doubt some of the leading lights in the Virginia Company watched the first performance of The Tempest on Hallowmas night in November 1611, in the presence of the king. Shakespeare's patron, the Earl of Southampton, was a founder member of the Virginia Company, and Shakespeare himself was an investor. Were the Earl and his friend Sir Thomas Smythe among the courtiers applauding on that first night in the Palace of Whitehall? In Jamestown, there was nothing to applaud. When Sir Thomas Gates and Sir George Somers and the other survivors of the Sea Venture finally made the Jamestown settlement in 1610, they found that the colony marketed as an earthly paradise by Sir Thomas Smythe was more akin to hell. The ships of the Third Supply were supposed to have brought relief with adequate supplies and reinforcements. 6 of the vessels, though battered by the hurricane, did make port at Jamestown, but they had few supplies and didn't stay long. 4 left inside a month, taking with them the only man who had shown real ability as a leader, John Smith. As food supplies again ran out in Jamestown, the starving time had set in. Just how bad it was will always be unclear. A rush of self-serving and contradictory reports muddied the waters then and forever. What is certain is that when the survivors of the Sea Venture finally arrived at Jamestown from Bermuda, they found a ghost town. Behind the palisades, there were broken-down dwellings, a ruined church, and filthy, rubble-strewn streets. Sir Thomas Gates, the senior commander, decided that it was pointless to start again, and he decided to abandon the settlement. Taking the remaining colonists, number between 40 and 60, Gates was preparing to make for Newfoundland when De La Warr appeared with a relief fleet and turned him back. The new governor no doubt heard many explanations as to what had happened to the settlers. One eyewitness account was from George Percy, the last president of the Colonial Council, who later wrote up his recollections. He had seen near constant fighting with the Native Americans, who made it impossible to stray much beyond the Palisades, and then mass starvation set in, the prelude to a grim descent into cannibalism. After supplies of fish and corn ran out, horses and other beasts were eaten by colonists. Next they caught vermin, dogs and cats, and rats and mice. Then they ate boots, shoes, or any other leather. There were frantic forays into the woods, which netted a few snakes and some wild and unknown roots. Finally, they dug up corpses. Quote, famine began to look so ghastly and pale on every face that nothing was spared to preserve life. One man murdered his wife and chopped her in pieces and salted her for his food. The man was discovered with her partly eaten corpse and on Percy's orders hung up by his thumbs till he confessed and then was executed. The colonists themselves were blamed for their troubles, and they blamed each other. Stories of theft, murder, and mutiny emerged, and of astonishing lassitude and torpor. Too many of the settlers were drunken, gluttonous loiterers. Too many of the vulgar and viler sort, who went thither for ease and idleness, profit and pleasure, and found contrawise that they must labor or not eat. Before the governor could do anything much to put the colony to rights, he himself apparently became a victim of Jamestown. 6 months after landing, he reportedly collapsed. What was wrong with him was never satisfactorily explained. The suspicion lingers that it might have been as much the daunting task he faced in rescuing the colony, rather than the bite of an insect that disabled him. Whatever the truth, he ordered a ship to take him away from the Chesapeake to the healthier climate of the Caribbean. From there, he eventually went back to England. In an age when people firmly believed in auguries, this was not a good one. His lordship was never officially replaced as governor. In his place, Sir Thomas Dale, followed by Sir Thomas Gates, then Sir Thomas Dale again, served as acting governor. They would be credited with rescuing the colony and setting it on the path to prosperity. The most indelible mark was left by Dale. The High Marshal has been described as a sturdy watchdog, tearing and rending with a cruelty equal to his zeal every offender against the common will. He began to acquire that reputation from day one. On arrival in Jamestown after Lord Dewar's departure, he announced a new legal code for the colony, of which the Taliban would have approved. The laws divine, moral, and martial were most probably drawn up by De La Warr, Gates, and Dale in consultation with Smythe. They would become known as Dale's Code because it was he who implemented them. They were based on a code designed by a Dutch prince to keep his troops in order and required unquestioning obedience in everything. Quote, no manner of person whatsoever, contrary to the word of God, shall detract, slander, calumniate, murmur, mutiny, resist, disobey, or neglect the commandments, either of the Lord Governor and Captain General, the Lieutenant General, the Marshal, the Council, or any authorized captain, commander, or public officer, upon pain for the first time so offending to be whipped 30 times, and upon his knees to acknowledge his offense, asking forgiveness upon the Sabbath day in the assembly of the congregation, and for the second time so offending to be condemned to the galley for 3 years, and for the third time so offending to be punished with death. Even intemperate railings against authority was a capital offense carrying the same punishment as murder or sodomy. Along with murder, sodomy, rape, and lèse-majesté, the code made blasphemy and irregular attendance at church capital crimes. Everyone had to attend church twice a day. On Sundays, a bell sounded half an hour before the first service. The gates of Jamestown were barred and guarded, while search parties went into every building looking for anyone not in church. Those caught missing church 3 times faced execution. Special moral guards, 4 per preacher, were to be appointed to spy and report on what went on at other times. Englishmen had probably experienced nothing like it, since their ancestors were made serfs by their Norman conquerors 5.5 centuries before. Trading with the Native Americans was a capital crime, as was leaving the colony without permission or selling anything to visiting sailors. Pilfering a few potatoes could get you executed, and so, in theory, could the plucking of a rose. Quote, what man or woman shall rob any garden, public or private, being set to weed the same, or willfully pluck up therein any root, herb, or flower, or gather up the grapes, or steal any ears of the corn growing, shall be punished with death. Almost everything was to be communal. Meals were all to be eaten in refectories. There was no private ownership, and all work was for the company. Overseers stood over you to ensure that no one was negligent and idle. Tools and implements, even your own, had to be handed in when a drum or whistle sounded to end the day. The one mitigating factor was that the official working day was considerably shorter than in England, perhaps because of the climate, or to allow for military duties. Not everyone had to labor. Quote, "The extraordinary men, divines, governors, ministers of state and justice, knights, gentlemen, physicians, and such as to be men of worth for special purposes, were not to be required to work. As ever, England's class system automatically transferred across the seas." Dale enforced the laws to the hilt. Though a deeply pious man, he must have struck fear into friends as well as foes. On one occasion, he lost his temper with Christopher Newport, grasped the veteran captain by his beard, and shouted that he would execute him. Newport's mistake, it seems, was to have sounded too wildly positive about Virginia. George Percy was a witness to the exemplary punishments Dale handed out on the capture of half a dozen colonists who deserted after being ordered to help build a new fort. The fugitives had headed south in an attempt to reach Spanish-held territory 1,000 kilometers away in Florida. The High Marshal employed Native Americans to track down the fugitives and bring them back. Percy reported, quote, "Some he appointed to be hanged, some burned, some to be broken upon wheels, others to be staked, and some to be shot." Thieves faced a more protracted death. They were bound to trees and left there to suffer the attentions of a roaming bear or to starve. Similar treatment was meted out to anyone infringing the religious requirements. One blasphemer had a red-hot bodkin plunged through his tongue before he was chained to a tree and left to his fate. Another miscreant was similarly mutilated and then forced through a guard of 40 men to be butted by each one and then kicked out of the fort, no doubt to perish. Dale was less than a year into his term in the colony when he took the momentous step of calling on the Crown to provide convict labor. In desperate need of settlers, Virginia's hard man addressed the matter in his typically blunt way. In a personal letter to King James in August 1611, he vowed that if he could be furnished with 2,000 men by the following April, he would overcome the Algonquin tribes and completely settle the colony within 2 years. Recognizing the impossibility of raising so many men so quickly, he urged the king to banish hither all offenders condemned to die out of common jails. For the next 3 years, it would be a ready way to furnish us with men, and not always with the worst of men, either for birth or for spirit or body. Dale added that this was how the Spaniards do people the Indies. Francis Bacon, the future Attorney General, led the opposition to the scum of England being allowed to infect the colony. The views of this body of opinion had previously been summed up in one of the broadsides issued in 1609 during the company's promotional campaign, quote, "It would be a scandal and a peril to accept as settlers idle and wicked persons, the weeds of their native country. They would act as poison in the body of a tender, feeble, and yet unformed colony. What were needed were men who could show a character for religion and considerate conduct in his relations with his neighbors." Others, not least in the Privy Council, were insistent that some way had to be found to dispose of convicts and the country's swarms of vagrants. They argued that famine and pestilence would only disappear from England if all the unwanted could be shipped abroad. King James certainly took this line. He was a timid man who wore specially padded doublets to protect against the assassin's knife. After succeeding to the throne in March of 1603, his first appearance in London coincided with the devastating outbreak of plague in the capital. As always, it struck first and worst in the Liberties and other slums where vagrants concentrated. The new monarch arrived to find the merchants and gentry of London escaping en masse to the countryside in search of safety. Their king immediately followed suit and fled the capital. He took with him the lesson that the poor had to go. Sir Thomas Smythe, of course, was not one to argue with the king. A broadside dedicated to Smythe carried exactly the message James wanted to hear. It warned that unless somewhere far away was found for the swarms of the lewd and idle, more prisons would have to be built. One recurring proposal to rid the land of convicts was to exchange them with Christian galley slaves, held by the Turkish or North African corsairs. 4 convicts for 1 galley slave was the suggested exchange rate. Another proposal was to seek a remote, unpopulated location somewhere far away where England's felons could be dumped, provided with seeds to plant, and left there to sink or swim. Sir Thomas Smythe led the search for a site and initially considered South Africa rather than America. A letter written to Smythe in 1609 by one of his agents, Thomas Aldworth, put the case for a site at the Cape of Good Hope. Aldworth had anchored in Table Bay while he was en route for India and liked what he saw. An earlier European visitor had carved a huge cross on the steep mountain overlooking the bay. The vegetation grew lushly on the narrow peninsula, and the natives seemed friendly. Aldworth reported enthusiastically to Smythe that the Cape had courteous and tractable folk, and was just the place to send convicts. The area could take 100 English convicts a year, he estimated. Always cautious, Smythe decided to send just 10 convicts to see how they fared. How and where he obtained them we do not know. However, they included a highwayman called James Cross, whose name we know because the company listed him as the men's leader in the Cape. Cross and the other 9 were duly landed at Table Bay and presented with what Smythe's men deemed sufficient for their survival: half a peck of turnip seeds, a few other seeds, and a spade to dig the ground. Unsurprisingly, the experiment was a failure. Cross and the other convicts had been left with no arms with which to protect themselves, and they were terrified when they saw tribesmen from the local Khoi people in the distance. Maybe they had heard how Portuguese traders had once been massacred here after falling out with the Khoi. The convicts hid and managed to evade the natives. Somehow, they reached a rocky island just off Table Bay. It was a refuge that would one day be notorious as Robben Island, the prison where Nelson Mandela and so many other fighters against apartheid were held 3 centuries later. Here the 10 Englishmen eked out a miserable existence, probably living on shellfish or the seals that basked on the shore. Eventually, a visiting ship took pity on them and took them off. 3 of the convicts got back to England. Within hours, they'd become embroiled in a purse snatch and were arrested. They were later executed. Smythe tried once more. He ordered another group of convicts to be sent to the Cape aboard one of his India-bound ships. When it reached Table Bay and anchored, the convicts begged the captain to hang them rather than leave them in Africa. He couldn't oblige. Following orders, they too were dumped on the shore. However, Lady Luck was with this group. Another passing ship took them off within a couple of days. Nearly 2 centuries would pass before England would again send convicts to the Cape. The argument stirred up in 1611 by Sir Thomas Dale's call for convicts simmered for the next 4 years. Meanwhile, out of sight over in America, far bloodier contests were taking place as the Virginia Company's twin martinets, Sir Thomas Dale and Sir Thomas Gates, sent settlers out to build forts beyond the Chesapeake and deeper into Algonquin territory. This was the period of Pocahontas, the fairy tale story of the bewitching Native American princess who saved English colonists from a massacre, was kidnapped by one of them, and fell in love with another, and it gripped contemporaries just as it gripped later generations. It also lent a welcome romance to the colonizing process. The following, typically lyrical description of Virginia in these days, is from Mary Johnston's Pioneers of the Old South, quote, "As the company sent over more colonists, there began to show up and down the James, though at far intervals, cabins and clearings made by white men, set about with a stockade, and at the river edge, a rude landing and a fastened boat. The restless search for mines of gold and silver now slackened. Instead, eyes turned for wealth to the kingdom of the plant and tree, and to fur trade and fisheries." The reality was bloody guerrilla warfare between white and red, and between white and white. The Algonquin retreated before the superior firepower of the war parties dispatched by Dale and Gates. French settlements were also harried by the English. In 1613, Gates sent a 100-ton vessel called the Treasurer to the north to remove the French from Mount Desert Island. Its commander was Sam Argall, the man who had kidnapped Pocahontas. At Mount Desert Island, Captain Argall is said to have fired the first shots in the 150 Years' War in America between France and England. He looted and burnt the settlement and set half the surviving Frenchmen adrift in an open boat. The rest were taken to Jamestown, where their reception must have made them long to be adrift with their comrades. As soon as Dale saw them, he spoke of nothing but ropes and gallows, and of hanging every one of them. For the English behind the palisades along the James River, life continued to be grim. An unflattering but not necessarily wholly inaccurate picture of life in Jamestown was drawn by a Spaniard who was held prisoner there between 1613 and 1614. Don Diego de Molina had been captured after his ship was driven into Chesapeake Bay. He wrote a letter that was sewn into the sole of a shoe and somehow smuggled out to Madrid. Referring to the Virginia Company, he wrote, quote, "The merchants have not been able to maintain this colony with as much liberality as was needed, and so the people have suffered much want, living on miserable rations of oats or maize and dressing poorly. There is not a year when half do not die. Last year there were 700 people, and not 350 remain, because little food and much labor on public works kills them, and more than all, the discontent in which they live, seeing themselves treated as slaves with cruelty." Recruitment and investment were not helped by a drip, drip, drip of complaints filtering back to England. Those who had pledged to invest now began to renege on their commitments. Gondomar, the Spanish minister, wrote to Philip III, quote, "Here in London, this colony Virginia is in such bad repute that not a human being can be found to go there in any way whatever." What made the days still darker for the colony was the emergence of the Bermudas as a rival. In 1612, a royal charter authorized a settlement, and a party of 60 settlers landed. In honor of Sir George Somers, who had been so memorably marooned on the archipelago, it was renamed the Somers Island, and like Virginia, promoted as a paradise, but with no Native Americans to combat and a healthy climate to boot. The number of settlers tumbled in Virginia, but soared in Bermuda. By 1614, there were 600 colonists there, nearly twice as many as in the senior colony. The discovery of a gigantic piece of amber on a beach seemed to confirm that the islands, rather than the mainland, were the future. A rumor circulated that the company was to close down all operations in Virginia and relocate everyone to the new colony. Sir Thomas Dale was so concerned that he wrote a personal appeal to Sir Thomas Smythe. Typically, it pulled no punches. Quote, "Let me tell you all at home this one thing, and I pray remember it. If you give over this country and lose it, you, with your wisdoms, will leap such a gudgeon as our state hath not done the like since they lost the kingdom of France. I protest to you, by the faith of an honest man, the more I range the country, the more I admire it. I have seen the best countries in Europe, and I protest to you before the living God, put them all together, this country will be equivalent unto them, if it be inhabited with good people." Dale need not have worried. Smythe found the money to keep the Virginia Company going. He staved off one crisis by persuading the king to give him the go-ahead to do what the great Italian merchants in Venice and Genoa did, and raise money by a lottery. It was the first lottery in 50 years, and only the second in England's history, netting a staggering £8,000, the equivalent of £1 million today. But even that was not enough. In another crisis, Smythe asked investors to forego their first dividend and accept the promise of a tract of forest somewhere in Virginia. Somehow, he persuaded them. Meanwhile, he was constantly going to court to pursue those who had reneged on investment pledges. It was now 7 years since the first batch of settlers had been brought by Christopher Newport, which meant that survivors were no longer tied to the company. They could go home or stay on as tenants. Of those who stayed, a favorite group, whom Dell referred to as farmers, were allotted a 3-acre garden apiece, or 12 acres if they had families, and allowed to cultivate it as they pleased. But the company wanted a rental of 2.5 barrels of corn an acre, plus 30 days public service every year. The conditions imposed on a second larger group of stayers, the laborers, were even more onerous. In any year, they would have to work for the company for 11 months, leaving just 1 month in which to raise corn to feed themselves. This was a far cry from what had been promised 7 years earlier, but it was a start. Private ownership of land would begin to spread rapidly. Ralph Hamer, Dale's secretary, caught the importance of the chains in a memorable comment once taught to every American child, quote, "When our people were fed out of the common store and labored jointly together, glad was he who could slip from his labor or slumber over his task. He cared not how, nay, the most honest among them would hardly take so much true pains in a week as they now themselves will do in a day." This dawning of private enterprise coincided with the discovery that a tobacco agreeable to the English palate could be cultivated in Virginia. In 1613, the planter John Rolfe, who later married Pocahontas, produced the colony's first commercial crop of tall tobacco, and it was shipped to England the following year. Gold hadn't been discovered, but here was a cash crop that would prove as valuable as the mines that the settlers had dreamt of. But cultivating it would need masses of labor, and would be so arduous that few could bear it for long. The manpower wastage would be enormous. In London, the variety produced by Rolfe was an instant success. Very quickly, other planters followed Rolfe's lead. But Virginia's grim reputation kept immigration low. A new initiative was needed. In 1614, the Virginia Company lawyer Sir Richard Martin outraged MPs when he was allowed to address the House of Commons on behalf of the company and roared at them to stop wasting time on trivial matters and concentrate on saving Virginia. Martin demanded they set up a committee to consider how to populate the colony. England had lost one chance of an American empire when Henry VII turned down a request for backing from Christopher Columbus. But when Martin urged them not to lose this second chance, he was forced to come back the next day to apologize. Early in 1615, the Privy Council finally reached a decision on convicts. Francis Bacon's faction lost. Convicts would be transported to the New World. In presenting the decision, the Privy Council trod carefully. It is difficult to picture the rich, hard-nosed advisors of James I being overly concerned about the rights of vagabonds and felons, but this was a period that was especially suspicious of arbitrary acts by the Crown against individuals. There was no law enabling the Crown to exile anyone, including the basest convict, into forced labor. According to legal scholars, the Magna Carta itself protected even them. The Privy Councillors therefore dressed up what was to befall the convicts and presented the decree authorizing their transportation as an act of royal mercy. The convicts were to be reprieved from death in exchange for accepting transportation. The Privy Council's decree read, quote, "Whereas it hath pleased His Majesty, out of His singular clemency and mercy, to take into His princely consideration the wretched estate of divers, and of His subjects who, by the laws of the realm, are adjudged to die for sundry offences, though heinous of themselves, not of the highest nature, so His Majesty, both out of His gracious clemency, as also for the divers weighty considerations, could wish they might be rather corrected than destroyed, and that in their punishments some of them might live, and yield a profitable service to the Commonwealth in parts abroad where it should be found fit to employ them. To the extent that it is better to live than die, it was an act of mercy in some degree to send convicts to the colony rather than to the scaffold. Perhaps the scum would prove useful members of the colonial community and one day even earn their freedom in Virginia. But that was not the underlying intention. 4 years later, in 1619, the Privy Council made the intention clear. It ordered that convicts sent to parts abroad were to be constrained to toil in such heavy and painful works as such servitude shall be a great terror than death itself. To some, transportation did appear from the start to be worse than death. The Spanish ambassadors to London reported home that 2 prisoners destined for transportation to Virginia had, like the convicts left on an African beach, pleaded to be executed instead. Immediately after the Privy Council's decision, 17 convicts were assigned to Smythe, following by a batch of 5, then a group of 6. It seems that Smythe was allowed to cherry-pick from the condemned and select those he thought would be most useful. One man was saved from death on account of being of the mystery of the carpenters. King James had rather different ideas about selection. In the early years of his reign, he built a palace near the village of Newmarket in East Anglia, 70 miles away from London, which he hated. It was the king's favorite bolt hole. Away to Newmarket, away to Newmarket, was the signal for extravaganzas of drunken feasting, masks, jousting, and horse racing. At Newmarket, James paraded his homosexuality for all to see, as he indulged and openly fondled Robert Carr, George Villiers, and other male lovers. Anyone disrupting the prolonged roistering invited an outburst of royal fury. Sometime in 1617, rowdy youths began to make nuisances of themselves at the court. Various explanations have been offered as to the nature of these youths, among them being that they were young, jobless men who made a practice of trailing round after the royal retinue, or that they were simply hoodlums or felons, or that they were the bastard sons of royal courtiers. Whatever they were, their crime is not recorded. Perhaps they specialized in baiting some of the roughed and perfumed young men at court who hoped to catch the king's fancy. Whatever it was, something prompted James to explode, and he had the youths arrested. In January of 1618, Sir Thomas Smythe received a letter from the king saying that 100 youths were being dispatched to him to dispose of in Virginia at the first opportunity. They were described variously as dissolute or convicts, though there is no record of their having been tried in any court of law. The king instructed Smythe to take sure order that they be set to work in the colony. There were, however, no Virginia Company ships available in London or Bristol or Plymouth, and for all Thomas Smith's worldwide trading interests, he had no vessels to spare either, or pretended he didn't. But the king would brook no excuses. Robert Cecil's successor as Secretary of State, Sir George Calvert, summoned Smythe to Whitehall and banged the table. The king's desire admitted no delay, he was told. Reluctantly, Smythe and his fellow merchants in the Virginia Company put aside £1,000 to pay for the miscreants to be held in a London jail until transportation was arranged. Smythe feared that once they were at sea, the prisoners would break free and take over the ship. As we shall see, when convicts became a major business, with up to 200 shipped at a time, this is what happened again and again. It was decided that the prisoners should be split into smaller, easily managed groups. At least 4 vessels were needed. While the company vacillated over their unwanted prisoners, 3 of the wealthiest stockholders saw an opportunity. The Earl of Warwick, Sir Edwin Sandys, and John Farrar had all acquired land in Virginia's sister colony, the Summer Islands. It appears they took advantage of the Newmarket affair to secure forced labor to work their plantations. The Virginia Company's minutes record the 3 applying for some of the dissolute to be sent to the Summer Islands to be servants upon their land. Their fellow stockholders agreed. We do not know where all 100 convicts finally went, but given King James' determination to make an example of them, we can assume that they were dispatched to one or another colony, or perhaps to both, probably never to return. The door was opening for the transportation of Britons unwanted to America, and the first to come flooding through were street children.